Welcome to CMO's Off Script. We're 5 experienced health tech leaders offering trends, tips, and honestly, a few hot takes. Let's do this. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all. I'm going to raise a glass. Today we've got to Laura. Today we've got Bethany, Nisha, Julia, and Amanda here in the room. And we're delighted to be discussing a topic that is important as we step into Q4, which is 2025 planning. So we know that no CMO is immune from the planning cycle, and frankly, it's critical to our work as we look forward to the coming year. And so we wanted to spend a few minutes with all of you today discussing the key elements of a great 2025, a coming year planning season. So before we dig right in, I want to say planning is intricately linked with the topic of budget. So I want to acknowledge that and also say we may not be hitting all of the things tied to budget in this episode. We may discuss this high level, and we may, if we can, we'll tackle it. And if we can't, we'll parking lot that to the next episode. But we know that's really important. And so I wanted to just put that out up front because that is such a crucial part of any conversation. You can't plan if you don't have a budget. But let's dive in. Planning, really important. What is the first step that you take when you're getting ready to start to build your coming year plan?
For me, it's aligning with the other leaders across the organization, understanding what the sales team is focused on and what's really going to move the needle from their perspective. Also speaking to the product team and seeing what's coming down the pipe from a roadmap perspective. Also talking to customer success and understanding kind of what the gaps we need to fill are from a customer perspective. So those are always ongoing conversations, but I think it definitely gets more meaningful and maybe more defined during this time. So that's kind of where I start.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, you've got to have great alignment with your leadership team, making sure you have line of sight to goals and objectives and the story that you can tell through the product roadmap. I think the best friend of your CMO, especially many times, but especially during the season, is your CFO, because you want to have very clear alignment on where the program spending or the platform or software spending is, how that interacts with your people spending, and that you're a consistent partner. You know, you said you would spend this amount in a month, and that was the amount that happened, give or take, and that you're predicting. And, you know, there's a joke that is related to, you know, if you're in a relationship or perhaps you're married or in another arrangement, if you tell your spouse you're going to go to, you know, the kitchen and you walk out the front door, you better explain why. You know, and the same is true when you're talking about planning or budgeting at large spending. You know, you want to have a pretty consistent, you know, big picture alignment.
One thing I can add to that is also just doing a retro of the current year. I mean, we're still in the current year, but I'm definitely looking at all the numbers from first through third quarter and seeing kind of, again, what campaigns really worked, what tactics worked, what weren't so great. And we definitely know we want to strike from the record for next year. So that's another place that I'm spending a lot of my time right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to double down on just from an industry perspective, keeping an eye on some of the trends that are upcoming in the year and making sure. And, you know, we mentioned aligning with product, but I think it also from just a thought leadership perspective and stepping up as a marketing organization, ensuring that we kind of have our eye on the horizon as well. And so that's something that we should have been doing throughout the year, but it really comes into fruition during this planning period.
So I think there's an interesting thread there around this idea of like, we're looking at these things now as we're stepping into Q4 and we're planning ahead for the coming year. But I know that you all are looking at these things throughout the course of the entire year. What feels different about how you're reflecting on performance in, the past 3 quarters, or you're reflecting on where the market is at, what makes that look or feel different for you as you're stepping ahead and really looking at that coming year plan?
Yeah, you're right. On the one hand, we're always calibrating. So, month over month or week over week, you're looking at performance. And so you make adjustments. But when you take a step back and look at the whole year, there are programs or launches or campaigns that do take months to build. And so getting a year-long plan in place to guide your team, maybe it's your marketing team, maybe it's the total revenue team, maybe it's the strategic plan of the company, but that sort of once a year event to help have a big picture look that you build and then align on, and then you have maybe your quarterly review of that strategic plan. But there is something sort of momentous about it, because one, it's a big deal in a marketer's world. It's a big deal in a corporate planning cycle. And I sometimes feel that it builds up more pressure marketers feel in themselves, or more than the different functional leaders feel. And I think you just have to demystify why it's, important, and make it part of your regular routine. You're always calibrating and planning and trying to think, 3 quarters, 4 quarters out. And so I try to, just remind myself and others, this is a part of a normal planning cycle, but it isn't the only thing we're constantly planning.
Totally. That's great. Well, and I think the other thing that I think a lot about, pardon me, is as you're going through that planning process, this is the moment to really take that, I think to your point, really take that step back and provide that holistic view. And as you're in the day-to-day and the month-to-month, you're making some of those minor calibrations. But if you have to take a step back and actually look at that full year plan, you're looking at that in the context of those market forces that may be changing, and all of the other elements that gives you a moment of real pause, as opposed to I'm in the middle of flying the plane. And so we're never getting off that plane, but as you're planning ahead to the coming year, it gives you a moment to really pause and say, is there a different direction that the plane needs to be flying entirely? And that may actually, fundamentally change some of the elements of where you're investing your time, effort, and energy. Let's maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about, how are you planning? Top down, bottom up. What are the things that you're looking at? How are you orienting your planning so that you're successful in the coming year? What works best for you?
I'll jump. I focus on both at the same time. So it definitely is what I realized about myself is that I have a pretty good gut instinct or hypothesis driven, approach that I then try to prove out with the numbers. And usually it's about right. So I already know the big themes for the next year, which does feel very arbitrary, by the way. I think it's a continuous planning cycle that the only difference in fourth quarter is that everybody else is doing it at the same time, and you have to give specific numbers that are probably wrong but directionally correct for the next year, and that you'll recalibrate in the mid-year point again. But in any case, I think I really do focus on, here's my gut instinct, because I know, my team throughout the year has been telling me what's working, what isn't, what we need to do more of. I start to listen to the market, listen to my colleagues on what they need to do. And then I'm proving everything out with numbers. Yes, this campaign did really well. We want to do 6 more of those next year. This other thing didn't work. We're going to not do that anymore. And again, kind of think about the spend versus ROI metrics that we're tracking, and kind of put those on display for everybody to see in a bigger way for the next year, and start tracking against those again. So I think it's a bit of both. And I let my team do a lot of the work on their functional areas to create their own plans and their own thoughts about where we should be going next year. And then we kind of calibrate as a team as I'm talking to the other leaders across the company.
Love that.
Yeah, I loved your point about the team and how we bring them in. We're only as good as the team that is planning with us, and often good ideas come from everywhere. And so there's, probably a tendency to work with your couple of most senior people, but you want to engage as many team members as you can and distribute some of the planning work, so that you can ladder up to a bigger, team-wide plan. It also helps, I think, have, when multiple people have stake in the game, they're more inclined to be excited about the tactics that ultimately land there. And then, I kind of tend to think training our future leaders to know and understand planning is important too. And so there's a little bit of, altruistic or paying forward, for the next gen, just to really put an age on it. So I liked your points about how teams can collaborate on that.
Yeah, I want to double down on the team aspect. And I'm curious just to learn a little bit of your approach, because in the past I've done it either way, and I'm not quite sure if I lean either way, but sometimes during planning, I love to directly hear sales feedback and take that into account for planning. And I like to be in the conversation. And other times I've encouraged team members to go source the feedback and then bring it back, and then we discuss as a marketing team. And so I'm curious, just to take a little query with the group, has either way, do you guys lean towards one of these approaches, or is there a different one?
I typically have built a plan based off of feedback and input from the sales organization, but not like going forward and soliciting their feedback on a fully baked plan until it's fully baked, and I'm really usually reviewing it with the ELT at that point. So I think from my vantage point, it's been more of an input process and I can maybe also just convey, hey, here's some future direction that I'm looking at, so there's no surprises, because I think my goal is no one should ever be surprised when I walk in to present a plan like that. So I'm making sure if there's anything that seems a little out of the ordinary or unexpected, that's going to be communicated in advance, so that I've got full alignment and support on the specifics where I think I need that. But in general, I'm getting that feedback early in the feedback loop, and then sharing back when and where I need to.
Yeah, I think the main point, essentially, I think regardless of the approach, is just because we need that buy-in, not only from the rest of the stakeholders, but from our sales counterparts. We need them to be sold early on. Yes, getting their input in the beginning rather than getting it at the end, I think is one of the things that's worked the best. But oftentimes, when I'm as a marketing leader, if I'm not hearing the feedback directly, sometimes I feel I almost want to be connected to that directly and hear it from the source. And so it's interesting.
Yeah, another thing marketing should really be bringing to the table, in my opinion, is voice of the customer. So the sales team has it from their perspective. Can we be doing additional research or additional conversations? Most marketing teams don't spend enough time with customers, myself included. It's just been, every team I've been on, we're always just like, how do we get more time with customers? How do we spend more time understanding their pain points, their needs, create feedback loops with both the product team and the sales team, and help refine and define our messaging a bit more. But we never get enough time for that. So it is something that I try to focus on more in third and fourth quarter, so that we can come into the planning cycle with a bit of new information, because it's hard to get that. And so setting up longer term systemic feedback loops with customers is really important. And maybe if you don't have that set up, you can try to listen to gong calls or, just talk to sales. But I think, you got to figure it out somehow.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I love that point. You're hearing, we're all excited about that. Nothing's more compelling than as a marketer starting a call with colleagues or meetings, a meeting, should you ever be in person with your team, starting a call by saying, I spoke to a customer last week and this is what I learned. The room will stop when they hear a marketer say that, and everyone likes we are in the business to stay in business, and you have to, we work so hard to get customer engagement and turn that into pipeline and turn it into contracts that, to not be engaged with them any longer, it is an obvious thing. And yet as marketers, we're always going back to how do we get more? And so I love the rhythm of one, talking to customers, could be through a voice of the customer program or other sentiment surveys you set up, but making sure that that's embedded in, your work. It also allows you to think about competitive defense. You hear a customer is rising in an area or lacking in an area, you can then use that as a part of your strategy for the next year.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think love the customer feedback. It's super important. And I think the other piece of the puzzle that I've observed during my years in this space is we hear things differently than other folks do. We're looking and listening for things and catching things that other folks may not. They're coming at it from a very different lens. Your salesperson is keenly focused on how do I get the deal? And they're listening for insights. And I have worked with some tremendous salespeople who are incredibly talented at extracting things that they know are important, but they're important for a specific reason. And they may be missing things that we're catching. And so I love listening, even sitting alongside a salesperson on a call or listening to that gong, you're hearing different things than your salesperson may be, and learning something along the way. So whether that's a direct or an indirect conversation with a customer or prospect, you're hearing different things. And I think there's a ton of value in gathering that voice of the customer. Nisha, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I actually have a follow-up question to something that Bethany brought up. So Bethany was saying you use a combination of both bottoms up and top down. And, for those of us folks who may have joined an organization that doesn't have great historical data, because for bottoms up, you have to be able to measure those conversion rates from each point of the funnel. And so what's your tip for you come into an organization, there's not a lot of historical data for you to do a semi-accurate bottoms-up calculation. What do you do?
I don't know if I have good tips here. You don't do it. You make a bet and then you start tracking information, I think. And some of it's an educated guess around here's what our competitor is doing. Like I do a look at the market and see what's happening. I am listening to the sales team saying here's a need, let's go do this thing. A lot of times you don't have historical data and you place a bet. And so I think part of your budget or part of your planning process has to say, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to focus on that's net new activities. And we're going to call this an experiment. And we're going to set some benchmarks, maybe based on what's happening in the market or, industry benchmarks or standards or things that from your experience. And then you see if it works out. So my events program had a lot of that this year where we were we've never been to this event before. This is a new buyer audience for us or, that kind of thing. And we had to just place a bet, see, make sure that we showed up in the best way possible and then track the results from there. So I think there's a lot of times when you're going in blind and trying something new. That's part of the fun of seeing if things will work out. And I think ultimately you set up a pilot small in scale so that you can learn from that and do some testing and then, try to build data as you go. But I think what I come into a lot with organizations is they had a whole event program or some program that happened the year before and nobody was tracking anything. Customers don't have Google Analytics set up, literally. So there's no tracking their digital program. There's no understanding how marketing is effective or not. So I think right away you're trying to set up some of those fundamental elements so that you can track in the future and get some line of sight into your performance.
It's a great point. And
that was it. That was the tip.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. And then I think that the part at the very end, right, when you're doing annual planning and you're making those big bets and trying something new is essentially just calling out the risks involved in the process and outlining those and making sure you're communicating with everybody else. Because yes, oftentimes you're not only instinct, it's gut, it's what your competitors are doing. It's a whole host of other things, and you have to just be able to execute. And I like the shorter timelines on some of those aspects, right? Rather than think about it from a whole year perspective, to just say, let's try it out for a quarter and then keep iterating.
Yeah. There are times where you inherit less than you want. And if you're coming in on a consulting basis, or you're coming in as the new leader of the org, either way, you're going to have to look at the people and the process and the data. And there may be a lot and there may be not much to react to. And you kind of have to go back to basics, looking at Google Analytics, just like you said. What are the, conversions, if any? What are the sources, if any? And you generally know a properly built paid search program will generate lower intent, ready to talk to sales, most likely. But you also know that your customer base is probably your best source of upsells, right? There's some sort of practical matters that you can start to build upon and just look at, are we doing some standard things well? Are we doing standard things? And if so, are we doing them well? And then where do we go next to level it up? Every company is a little different, but there are some, standards a scaling company will need as part of the marketing mix.
Awesome. Well, I think you hit on something that I would love for us to spend a few minutes talking about, which is, as you're thinking about your 2025 planning, it's not just what is the marketing plan, right? It is what are the people, technology, it's the programs, but it is also as much the people, the technology, and. So let's talk about that. What are the components as you're thinking about your 2025 plan, your coming year plan? What are the critical elements for you, and how are you balancing your time as you're thinking through, as you're thinking this through?
Yeah, I'll jump in. You want to break out those macro areas you have, which are typically people, your team, the programming, maybe the campaigns or the launches or other things that you're doing, and then the software or platform that's serving you. So it could be your CRM, it is your marketing automation. Maybe you have other tech that you use, whether it's software in support of the SDR team or others. There's a whole host. And if you, dear listener, if you would like to go back, we talk about tech stack in a deep way in season 1. So when you look at those macro areas, you want to have some historical, so you can work with your finance team to have them break it out like that previously, so you can see what are my ratios. There's a number of theories about what your ratio should be, but typically one rule of thumb is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and that way you can identify: am I over on programming, or am I over on platform, but I'm not getting the most out of my software? Is there something that's redundant that I could cut in order to fund something else? Maybe you have 2 softwares that do something similar. Can you take one out? And so there's a look at those trade-offs, and then what that might need to look like to balance that a little more evenly. And then, of course, how are you contributing to pipeline? Like, what is what is the cost to generate an opportunity, and what is the cost to generate a contract? And then kind of look at the different streams that might go into that. It might be cheaper to generate a contract through or pipeline and contract through paid search, because digital is typically your lowest cost, but events are higher. You still need to be present to win and have brand represented. And so you have to look at these different, sort of contributing sources to decide where the mix should land.
Same. I agree with that. I again, include my team in the conversation. So for each of my functional leaders, I'm asking them what they need and what they need to sort of go big or go home next year, versus like almost some scenario planning, right? Of like, what's a big year? What's on your really big wish list that we could do? And then also what's just sort of status quo? Do you need help to do the big thing next year? And what does that look like? And it's sometimes surprising to me how many times people are like, I got it, it's all good. And so sometimes it's a matter of kind of helping people understand how much more they could do if they had more resources, more time, more budget, those kinds of things. It's sometimes a balance of like, it depends on where you are in your company life cycle and what the needs of the business are. But a lot of times in a high growth startup situation in health tech, I'm looking at, pushing the team to go bigger. and spend more and like get more leads out there and move the needle in a bigger way. And so that's kind of a fun time to be in this business. There's also the times when you have to like, how are we going to do more with less team, and how can we pull in AI to like get the same job done with the same amount of people, you know, like get a bigger job done with the same amount of people. So I think, you know, there's a lot of things that are on my mind when I'm going into those conversations. And I think one thing we haven't talked about a lot here, and maybe we can get into this a little bit, is just like we should be thinking about the vision and direction of the company overall and how we're going to lean into new spaces in the coming year that are, you know, maybe different pivots, bigger milestones, announcements. Are we on the right track as a company? How can we reposition? Like all of those things are also like stuff that's kind of on our mind here, and like communicating those visions down to your team, and then also including that in the planning process. So I feel like there's a lot of layers to this, including the tech, including the new team members, that you're bringing a lot of people along on this journey that you're not even sure sometimes where you're going to end up at the end of the conversation. So there's a lot of art to the science here.
I think that's really important, though, this idea of bringing people along and making sure that you're tapped into where the future direction of the company is headed. And particularly, you know, in that growth phase where, you know, you may be acquiring new products, you may be introducing new products and services, right? Like there's a whole lot of stuff that could be on the horizon that's directly impacting where the business is headed. And you need to have visibility into that so that you're prepared with the right staff, with the right, you know, programming. Like everything needs to be, you know, as much as you can. And obviously, I think the reality is we can't always predict that. Things may change in the back half of a year, or, you know, the market may change. I mean, anything could happen. But as much as you can plan for that stuff, it's super helpful to ensure that you're set up for success and you're setting up the business for success.
That's exactly right. You know, your remark reminded me in Bethany's before, you have to keep in mind what's the ultimate outcome. Are we seeking to grow to be able to go public? Are we trying to be acquired in 2 years' time by a strategic? Is there a third door? And so you might do things differently. If you know that you are seeking to be acquired by a strategic in 2 years, you need this year and next year to look pretty efficient, and especially more efficient as quarters go on in terms of spending. And so you might have a different decision. So in terms of spending and in terms of revenue. So you might have a different decision if you were thinking about a rip and replace of your marketing automation, and you're going to change it out, and you know that that's going to be like a certain time period of lull to improvement, and it's going to be 100,000 more. I'm just making up numbers. You might not do that. You might say, I'm going to make it as good as I can right now, and know it will be sufficient to help us rise by doing good and routine marketing principles and some pretty exciting campaigns, versus ripping and replacing and taking the software change. My software friends won't be excited about that kind of perspective, but you have to weigh it in light of the bigger picture. And if, you know, growing revenue and reducing cost is what you have to do in, you know, the next 6 months, you're going to behave a little differently than if you are growing at all costs for an unforeseeable time frame. So, you know, having that connection and trust with your CEO and CFO to, you know, be in the room is where a marketer wants to be, to understand those goals and have that in mind when they're making decisions.
And to be effective, right? Like at the end of the day, our goal is to support whatever the goals of the business are. And you cannot be effective if you're not connected closely to those goals. Yeah.
And I think the one thing I'll add to that we might have touched on, I think in previous seasons, is, you know, just being present at those tables. And sometimes I've caught myself, because we end up doing our planning well before the end of the year, or we start to think about planning well before we are forcing sometimes conversations between certain folks and like your product counterparts on trying to figure out what is the strategy for next year. What does the roadmap look like when they might not be ready to have those conversations? And so lots of times I've found myself as like the facilitator of getting your counterparts together to discuss their planning and get them started and helping them kind of think about next year so that you as the marketing leader can do your side as well. And that's where, I mean, it all goes back to, I think we talk a lot about marketing influencing other leaders within the organization. And this is one of those areas of where we can't do our job well if we don't know what the business goals are, if we don't understand the product roadmap, if we're not present when all these discussions are being held. And so I think that level of influence across the organization is very apparent in this quarter, because we're often the ones that are forcing people to sit together and we're like, here, finance and product, please talk about how you are going to expand our product line next year, because we need to.
Love that. Well, this has been a really great start to a conversation. I know that there is so much more to discuss, particularly when it comes to how budget plays a role in this conversation, because we would be remiss to act as though these conversations don't involve that conversation with our CFO and how we are budgeting for the coming year and the role that plays. So we're going to take a pause and continue that conversation next time, and look forward to having you join us as we discuss the role of budget in our 2025 planning or coming year planning. Thanks everybody for being with us. Any final parting thoughts before we jump off?
Constant strive for alignment. You must always be working together with your leaders.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll take that as our final parting thought. I think it's a great one, and look forward to being with you next time. Thanks, everybody. That's a wrap for this episode of CMO's Off Script. This podcast was made possible by Breezy Hill Marketing. Don't forget to explore the podcast notes or cmosoffscript.com for additional insights and resources. Until next time, be bold and stay curious.